welcome back. This is the second part on philosophical questions in the large language models discourse. If you haven't seen part one, I strongly recommend that you go check it out. You can find the link in the description of this video. Very roughly, the first video covers some questions from the classical debates in philosophy that pertain to the discussion about the nature of large language models. Now, in this part, we're going to go a little bit beyond these more introductory or historical analysis of the large language models philosophy, if you wish to call it that way. And we're going to think a little bit more concretely about interpretability, about multimodal systems as LLMs are evolving into systems that have more capabilities and they're not just writing models. And that question about perhaps their minds of some sort and what does that mean. And finally, some highlights on how the systems potentially capture some parts of human cognition. So we're going a little bit further than the classical historical discourse and the philosophy of LLMs. The way I see what we're trying to accomplish here is that we're essentially developing a theory of science for LLMs. This is a kind of meta-scientific discourse. And you'll notice that in the paper by Millier and Buckner, the kind of writing and the kind of discussion is not something that you would find in a technical AI paper, which I think can be a virtue, which is a good thing. It creates the space for further discussion that's on a different level and not just on a purely technical understanding of how the systems work and what they do and how we could advance their capabilities. And so that's why I understand this more as a theory of science for LLMs, where we get to break down the meta questions and see the big picture for what this new technology does, and even more, what does this new technology mean about cognitive science and the nature of cognition. So the first point I wanted to highlight from the paper, again, it's the paper titled The Philosophical Introduction to Language Models. This is the second part, The Way Forward by Raphael Millier and Cameron Buckner. I think these are two excellent papers for anyone who wants to think more about the continuity, essentially, between philosophy and the theory of science for language models in this way of, in the Quinean quotation of philosophy of science is philosophy enough. I think these two papers exhibit this feature very well. There's a clear continuity between the science of LLMs and the philosophy of science. And so my first remark here is that the way we benchmark these systems, which means the way we evaluate them and we kind of try to assess their cognitive capabilities, brings forth a series of shortcomings and problems that we have to understand and we may have to overcome, especially if we want to go deeper into the nature of LLMs. And so as you see here, there's this problem of saturation, gamification, contamination, construct validity, problems that have to do with experiment design, the empirical processes that take place in examining these systems and testing their capabilities and predictive validity. And this is essentially what's wrong, if you want to call it that way, with the science of behavioral evaluations. That's what benchmarking is about. So the first point mostly concerns the purely behavioral study of the models, and some points to keep in mind if we want to kind of make sure that this kind of evaluation does not betray the scientific standards that we would want to reliably study and more robustly study these systems. So this is sort of the first step, starting from LLM behavior, but then we can go into more questions about the nature of explanation. So when we say we want to explain how LLMs work, right, this is also a motivation behind interpretability for AI safety and alignment more generally. We're trying to explain different aspects of the behavior and the cognitive properties of LLMs. And so we have to have a better understanding of what kind of explanations we're seeking exactly, because this is going to help us determine the exact direction we're going to be gearing our research towards. And again, this is a historical or an older philosophy of science problem, that you look at those systems and you have to know what you're looking for, in a sense, or you have to have some direction, some guidance. Otherwise, merely looking at them, and as some say, well, we know everything about LLMs because we build them, right? We engineer those systems. We know the math behind it. We have the architecture. We know what data we feed into them. And yet, this is not enough. This is not enough because these systems dynamically learn. And so we have to point to different aspects of their cognition. And we have to get more specific about what these are, even. And so here they talk about mechanistic explanation in the paper. Mechanistic explanation is about exactly trying to reveal the causal structure that underlies a given phenomenon. So sort of like if there's a mechanism, how would we characterize that mechanism? What are the properties? What are the capacities? What are the causal interactions between the different parts of the system that we're studying? And so this kind of explanation goes beyond just describing how the model works. So what I mentioned before, here's some math, here's some numbers, here's an architecture. This is about understanding the causal structure, cause and effect relations in the system, and revealing in this way how the phenomenon comes to happen out of this causal structure. Not just here's some regularities, here's some mathematical descriptions. And so this seems to be a very important first step. However, it has its own limitations in these systems. We can understand it in terms of this interventionist model. What is interventionist? Very briefly, you make a change on X and you observe how it affects Y. And so if you try to trace causal connections and counterfactually what happens if one part is different, what happens to the other part, how is it's impacted. And so we are interested in the causal relationships and how they're understood in terms of what would change under interventions or manipulations to parts of the system. This is a classic philosophy of science model of understanding causation in a system. But also for interpretability and LLMs, we're interested in opening the black box because there are parts of the system that concern the function, concern the representation, the computations that take place within the system. So we want to open this black box and not just look at behaviors and if you change this part, what happens outside of it. But could you have some internal access, which is in a sense a privilege that we have with artificial intelligence systems versus with neuroscience and the human brain or animal brains, where we cannot just go and cut a piece of the brain. Well, here, this is considered a privileged access, an easier way to study those systems, even though it might not be as easy as it looks. And finally, defining this mechanistic interpretability research direction within AI safety as well, where they're specifically trying to reverse engineer neural networks in terms of features and circuits that operate on those features. So trying to isolate a part of the neural network and study in terms of reverse engineering, find the algorithms that correspond to the behavior that we are interested in. And so mechanistic interpretability has this perhaps more robust nature, or at least that's the hope and aspiration, that we're targeting the algorithmic level of analysis and we want to know exactly how information flows in the network and exactly what are those features and circuits that correspond to the behaviors that we want to know more about. Often safety relevant behaviors. For example, we want to know whether a system could be lying to us. So one question is, could mechanistic interpretability give us a correspondence between that behavior we're worried about and an algorithm? So this is an open question. Now, in the paper, they talk about minds, right? Which is a kind of natural question to have given all the capabilities the systems exhibit. And we're necessarily using the C word, consciousness, even though we are very uncertain about the nature of consciousness and even how to study that phenomenon in those systems. There are also many open questions in studying consciousness in humans. So there's nothing here to be said with high degrees of certainty. However, if we assume computational functionalism as our working hypothesis, we could start thinking about parallels with the human brain. And so there are some proposals on some theories of consciousness and how they could be generalized to LLM brains so that we can find those parallels that maybe by way of, for example, looking for brain modules in the LLM architecture, and we could just understand whether there are some similarities and whether similar phenomena arise just in virtue of similar architectural characteristics. So this is very much an open discussion, but I did want to bring it up since it's an important issue for many reasons, not just pure scientific curiosity, but also questions that pertain to AI welfare, for example, and legal status and moral agency or patienthood. And finally, how do LLMs help us understand cognition more broadly? LLMs, in a sense, offer a model of cognition. There's a lot of talk about alien intelligence. Maybe there's this kind of alien mind that we are creating. What does that mean exactly? It seems very, very similar to us, to human brains in many ways, but it's also very different in many other pretty meaningful ways. So what they say here in the paper is that LLMs do capture some aspects of the human capabilities, for example, this linguistic competence, but maybe they're also missing some other aspects of the human capabilities. However, how can we see them as useful tools for reverse engineering partial models of the processes or algorithms that human brains also use for linguistic competence? So, is there any way to think of LLMs in order to better understand how human brains generate language through this sort of prediction making process that seems to be taking place both in human and LLM brains? And from that, the conclusion of the authors is contrary to what is often suggested and was suggested by computer scientist and cognitive scientist Gary Marcus earlier, though, before the most recent AI systems. Whether LLMs are stagnating, whether they're plateauing at the moment, or the more quotable term, whether deep learning is hitting a wall, and how likely that is, given the capabilities of the models and their increasing competence across a variety of fields. So, if you're interested in seeing more of what the authors are talking about in this paper, I highly recommend that you read the whole paper. I merely tried to cover some parts of it and some highlights and give my perspective on what I think it's really worth looking into, not just from a philosophical perspective, but what perhaps could give some directions and some food for thought from a more technical AI safety perspective as well, and maybe even bridge the gap between the more theoretical side and the technical side.